Hey everybody, today I'm reading the introduction to the extended essay by Louis Althusser titled The Object of Capital. This essay is over 100 pages long. It starts on page 215 of the book and ends at page 356. So, I'm going to read each of the sections one at a time, so it'll be a bunch of shorter videos. So this is the first section. I'm going to try to remember to say what section they are when I post them up. And I'll eventually put them all into a nifty little playlist. So, let's see. Part 4, The Object of Capital, Louis Althusser. This is the Louis Althusser's essay from the book Reading Capital. I don't really know what to expect. I'm not a Louis Althusser expert. Anyway, in the half-arranged, half-spontaneous division of labor which presided over the organization of this collective study of capital, it fell to me to discuss Marx's relation to his work. Marx's relation to his work. That's in italics, that's why I read it twice. Try to do that when it's in italics. Under this title, I intend to deal with the following question. What image did Marx have and give of the nature of his undertaking? With what concepts did Marx think his innovations, and hence the distinctions between himself and the classical economists? In what system of concepts did Marx account for the conditions which gave rise to the discoveries of classical economics on the one hand, and his own discoveries on the other? With these questions, I intended to interrogate Marx himself, to see where and how Marx had theoretically reflected the relationship between his work and the theoretico-historical conditions of his work's production. In this way, I meant to pose Marx directly the fundamental epistemological question, which constitutes the object of Marxist philosophy itself, and to assess as accurately as possible the degree of explicit philosophical consciousness Marx had acquired during the elaboration of Capital. To make this assessment meant to compare the part Marx had illuminated in the new philosophical field that Marx had opened in the active foundation of his science with the part that had remained in the shade. By assessing what Marx had done, I wanted to represent as far as possible what Marx himself called on us to do in order to situate this field, to estimate this field's extent, and to make this field accessible to philosophical discovery. In short, to define as accurately as possible the theoretical space open to Marxist philosophical investigation. Such as my project at first sight, it might seem simple and require only to be carried out. Indeed, Marx left us in passing in the text and notes of Capital a whole series of judgments of his own work, critical comparisons with his predecessors, the physiocrats Smith, Ricardo, etc., and lastly, very precise methodological comments comparing his analytical procedures with the methods of, for example, the mathematical, physical, and biological sciences, and with the dialectical method defined by Hegel. Since, on the other hand, we possess the 1857 introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy, an extremely profound development of the earlier theoretical and methodological comments in Chapter 2 of The Poverty of Philosophy, published in 1847, it seems legitimate to believe that the set of texts really embraced the object of my reflection, and that a systematic arrangement of this already worked out material was all that was required for the epistemological project I have mentioned to take on body and reality. Indeed, it seemed natural to think that when Marx spoke of his work and his discoveries, Marx was reflecting on the innovatory character and therefore on the specific distinction of Marx's object in philosophically adequate terms, and that his adequate philosophical reflection was itself devoted to a definition of the scientific object of capital. The scientific object of capital, defining its specific distinction in explicit terms. But the protocols for a reading of Capital, which we have inherited from the history of the interpretation of Marxism, as well as the experiments in reading Capital, we can make ourselves confront us with real difficulties inherent in Marx's text itself. I shall assemble these real difficulties under two headings, and these two headings will constitute the object of my study. 1. Contrary to certain appearances, or at any rate to my expectations, Marx's methodological reflections in Capital do not give us a developed concept, not even an explicit concept, of the object of Marxist philosophy. They always provide the means with which to recognize, identify, and focus on it, and finally to think it, but often at the end of a long investigation, and only after piercing the enigma contained in certain expressions. Our question, therefore, demands more than a mere literal reading, even an attentive literal reading. Our question demands a truly critical reading. A critical reading which applies to Marx's text precisely the principles of the Marxist philosophy, which is, however, what we are looking for in Capital. The critical reading seems to constitute a circle, since we appear to be expecting to obtain Marxist philosophy from its own application. We should therefore clarify. We expect from the theoretical work of the principles Marx has explicitly given us, or which can be disengaged from Marx's works of the break and transitional works of the break and transitional works are in capital letters. We expect from the theoretical work of these principles applied to Capital, their development and enrichment as well as refinements in their rigor. The apparent circle should not surprise us. All, quote, production of knowledge implies it in its process. 2. But this philosophical investigation runs into another real difficulty. A real difficulty which no longer involves the presence and distinction of the object of Marxist philosophy in Capital, but the presence and distinction of the scientific object of Capital itself. Restricting oneself to a single, simple, symptomatic question around which turn most of the interpretations and criticism of Capital, what strictly speaking is the nature of the object whose theory we get from Capital. Is it economics or history? And specifying this question, if the object of Capital is economics, precisely what distinguishes this object in its concept from the object of classical economics. If the object of Capital is history, what is this history? What place does economics have in history, etc.? Here again, a merely literal reading of Marx's text, even an attentive literal reading, will leave us unsatisfied or even make us miss the question altogether, dispensing us from the task of posing this question, even though this question is essential to an understanding of Marx, and depriving us of an exact consciousness of the theoretical revolution induced by Marx's discovery and of the scope of Marx's discovery's consequences. Without doubt, in Capital, Marx does give us, in an extremely explicit form, the means with which to identify and announce the concept of Marx's object. What am I saying? Marx announces the concept of his object himself in perfectly clear terms. But if Marx did formulate the concept of his object without ambiguity, Marx did not always define with the same precision the concept of its distinction, i.e. the conception of the specific difference between Marx's object and the object of classical economics. There can be no doubt that Marx was acutely conscious of the existence of this distinction. His whole critique of classical economics proves that he was acutely conscious of the existence of this distinction. But the formulae in which Marx gives us this distinction, this specific difference, are sometimes disconcerting, as you shall see. The formulae do guide us onto the road to the concept of this distinction, but often only at the end of a long investigation, and once again after piercing the enigma contained in some of his expressions. But how can we establish the differential specificity of the object of capital with any precision without a critical and epistemological reading which assigns the site where Marx separates himself theoretically from his predecessors and determines the meaning of this break? How can we aim to achieve this result without recourse precisely to a theory of the history of the production of knowledges, applied to the relationship between Marx and his prehistory, i.e. without recourse to the principles of Marxist philosophy? As we shall see, a second question must be added to this one. Does not the difficulty Marx seems to have felt in thinking, in penser dan, I don't know what that means, P-E-N-S-E-R-D-A-N-S, italics, so penser dan, I'm assuming is how you pronounce that, a rigorous concept, the difference which distinguishes Marx's object from the objects of classical economics lie in the nature of Marx's discovery, in particular in Marx's discovery's fantastically innovatory character. In fact, that this discovery happened to be theoretically very much in advance of the philosophical concepts then available. And in this case, does not Marx's scientific discovery imperiously demand that we pose the new philosophical problems required by the disconcerting nature of its new object? The last argument calls on philosophy to participate in any in-depth reading of Capital in order to answer the astonishing questions asked of philosophy in Capital's pages, unprecedented questions which are decisive for the future of philosophy itself. Such is the double object of this study, which is only possible given a constant and double reference. The identification and knowledge of the object of Marxist philosophy at work in Capital presupposes the identification and knowledge of the specific difference of the object of Capital itself, which in turn presupposes the recourse to Marxist philosophy and demands Marxist philosophy's development. It is not possible to read Capital properly without the help of Marxist philosophy, which must itself be read, and simultaneously in Capital itself. In this double reading and constant reference from the scientific reading to the philosophical reading, and from the philosophical reading to the scientific reading, are necessary and fruitful, we shall surely be able to recognize in them the peculiarity of the philosophical revolution carried in Marx's scientific discovery, a revolution which inaugurates an authentically new mode of philosophical thought. We can convince ourselves that this double reading is indispensable a contrario to by the difficulties and misconstructions that simple immediate readings of Capital have produced in the past, difficulties and misconstructions which all revolve around a more or less serious misunderstanding of the specific difference of the object of Capital. We are obliged to register this remarkable fact. Until relatively recently, Capital was hardly read among, quote, specialists, end quote, except by economists and historians, of whom the former often thought that Capital was an economic treatise in the immediate sense of their practice, and the latter that certain parts of Capital were works of history in the immediate sense of their practice. This book, which thousands and thousands of worker militants have studied, has been read by economists and historians, but very rarely by philosophers, i.e., quote, specialists, end quote, capable of posing Capital the preliminary question of the differential nature of Capital's object. Footnote. For very profound reasons, it is often, in fact, political militants and leaders who, without being professional philosophers, were best able to read and understand capital as philosophers. Lenin is the most extraordinary example. Lenin's philosophical understanding of capital gave Lenin's economic and political analysis an incomparable profundity, rigor and acuity. In our image of Lenin, the great political leader all too often masks the man who undertook the patient, detailed, and profound study of Marx's great theoretical works. It is no accident that we owe to the first years of Lenin's public activity, the years preceding the 1905 revolution, so many acute texts devoted to the most difficult questions of the theory of capital. The book. 10 years of study and mediation on capital gave the man the incomparable theoretical formation which produced the prodigious political understanding of the leader of the Russian and international workers' movement. And this is also the reason why Lenin's political and economic works, not only the written works, but also the historical works, are of such theoretical and philosophical value. We can study Marxist philosophy at work in Lenin's political and economic works. In the, quote, practical, end quote, state, Marxist philosophy, which has become politics, political action, analysis and decision, Lenin, an incomparable theoretical and philosophical formation turned political. An incomparable theoretical and philosophical formation turned political. End footnote. With rare exceptions, all the more remarkable for that economists and historians have not been equipped to pose this kind of question, at least in a rigorous form, and hence they have not ultimately been equipped to identify conceptually what specifically distinguishes Marx's object from other apparently similar or related objects, whether contemporaneous with Marx or earlier. Such an undertaking has generally only been accessible to philosophers, or to specialists with an adequate philosophical education, because it corresponds precisely to the object of philosophy. Second, where am I? Where the hell's my coffee? You mean tell me I've been sitting out here with all my coffee? I would have had a panic attack if I knew that. Anyway, what philosophers who are able to pose capital the question of capital's object and of the specific difference that distinguishes Marx's object from the object of political economy, classical or modern, have read capital and posed capital this question. Knowing that capital was under a radical ideologico-political interdict imposed by bourgeois economists and historians for 80 years, we can imagine the fate reserved for capital by academic philosophy! Exclamation point. The only philosophers ready to take capital for an object worthy of a philosopher's concern could long only be Marxist militants. Only during the last 2 decades or 3 decades have a few non-Marxist philosophers crossed this forbidden frontier. But whether Marxist or not, these philosophers could only pose capital, questions produced by their philosophy, which is not generally equipped to conceive a real epistemological treatment of its object, even if it did not obstinately reject it. Among Marxists, besides the remarkable case of Lenin, we can mention Labriola and Plekhanov, the, quote, Austro-Marxist, end quote, Gramsci, and more recently, Rosenthal and Ilyenkov in the USSR, the school of Della Volpe in Italy, Della Volpe, Coletti, Pietranera, Rossi, etc., the numerous scholars in the socialist countries. The, quote, Austro-Marxists, end quote, were merely neo-Kantians. The Austro-Marxists produced nothing that has survived their ideological project. The important work of Plekhanov, and particularly that of Labriola, deserve a special study, as also, and on a quite different level, do Gramsci's great theses on Marxist philosophy. I shall discuss Gramsci later. It is no slander on Rosenthal's work, Problème de la dialectique dans le Capital, to reckon it partly beside the point here, since it merely paraphrases the immediate language with which Marx designates his object and his theoretical operations, without supposing that Marx's very language might often be open to this question. As for the studies of Ilyenkov, De La Volpe, Coletti, Pietranera, etc., they are indeed the works of philosophers who have read Capital and posed Capital directly, the essential question, erudite, rigorous, and profound works conscious of the fundamental relation linking Marxist philosophy with the understanding of Capital. But as we shall see, the concept they put forward of Marxist philosophy is often debatable. However, in every case, the same exigency is expressed everywhere in the investigation of contemporary Marxist theoreticians. A deeper understanding of the theoretical consequences of Capital requires a more rigorous and richer definition of Marxist philosophy. In other words, to return to classical terminology, the theoretical future of historical materialism depends today on deepening dialectical materialism, which itself depends on a rigorous critical study of Capital. History imposes this immense task on us. Insofar as our modest means will allow, we should like to make our contribution. Let me return to the thesis I am going to attempt to expound and illustrate. This thesis, it is clear, is not just an epistemological thesis, which only concerns the philosophers who take up the question of the difference between Marx and the classical economists. It is also a thesis which concerns economists and historians, and as an obvious consequence, political militants. In short, all of Capital's readers. Posing the question of the object of Capital, this thesis deals directly with the foundation of the economic and historical analyses contained in its text. It should therefore be able to resolve certain reading difficulties which have traditionally been opposed to Marx by his opponents as decisive objections. The question of the object of Capital is not therefore just a philosophical question. If what I have suggested about the relation between scientific reading and philosophical reading is well founded, the elucidation of the specific difference of the object of Capital may provide the means towards a better understanding of Capital and Capital's economic and historical content too. I close this forward with the conclusion that, if I have replaced the original project for this paper, which is intended to deal with Marx's relation to his work, with a second project dealing with the peculiar object of Capital, this was quite necessary. In order to understand all the profundity of the comments in which Marx expresses his relation to his work, it was necessary to go beyond their letters to the essential points which is present in all their comments, and in all the concepts which imply that relation, to the essential point of the specific difference of the object of Capital, a point which is both visible and hidden, present and absent, a point which is absent for reasons arising from the very nature of its presence, from the disconcerting novelty of Marx's revolutionary discovery. That these reasons may in certain cases be invisible to us at first glance surely derives in the last resort from the fact that, like all radical innovations, they are blinding. Okay, so that's chapter 1, the introduction to Louis Althusser's, what's the exact title again? The Object of Capital. Thanks for listening.